Welcome to the Living the International Life podcast, where we discuss all topics from studying, working, and living abroad, and even language learning. And I'm your host, Jazz Cole, president and founder of Multilingual and Philanthropic Incorporated. Let's dive right in. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Living the International Life podcast. I'm your host, Jazz, and here I'm with my best friend, Gabby Price, we've known each other since high school. And she's a med student, PhD student in New York, and she's here with me to discuss how international education can relate to her area of study, and as well as sharing her own experiences. So thank you, Gabby. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you for having me so much, Jazz. I greatly appreciate being on the podcast. I'm excited to dive in deep into some of my past as well as share our friendship. And I love the introduction, by the way, so thank you.
Yeah. Because I know for a fact, I'm mostly familiar with, your journey through education, but for a lot of people who obviously don't know you, I would love to know where your educational journey came about, as well as anything you want to share about your background.
Yeah, definitely. So would you suggest starting from K through 12 or college?
I would say through college, because I feel at that point,
okay.
It's yeah. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, no, that's better, because K through 12 that's a lot more detail. But for college, I went to Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. So it's a historically Black college, all women's college, and loved my experience at Spelman. I went largely because my parents wanted me to, and I got a scholarship, but it ended up being the best decision for me. And I majored in biology because I was pre-med, pretty hell-bent on becoming a physician. So I majored in biology, and throughout my time at Spelman, I was able to travel within the country to present my research and do summer programs, mainly in Boston. And my junior year, I finished college just because I'd taken a lot of courses and had some AP courses. And then decided to obtain a master's before going to med school. So I did that abroad, where I did it in the UK at Oxford and obtained a research master's in oncology. And I really enjoyed that experience in that it just equipped me to my PhD life, as well as run a lab, be in the lab. And then in 2019, I started in New York at Mount Sinai, the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, which is a medical school in East Harlem, and began my MD PhD. And so since 2019 until 2023, I've been working on my MD PhD. Just on Monday, I finished my PhD, so I'm very relieved and happy about that. So I have one more degree to go, which is my MD. Yeah.
Okay. And so when you're looking at specifically, because I know that when it comes to medicine, I feel at least when I was growing up, it was more of I think from my kid mindset, it's doctor, and it's you can do everything. And it's but it's I know as you get older, you realize that there's a lot of specialties, even for me with linguistics. I learned that, I didn't really know that psycholinguistics was a thing, and that ended up being something that I was really interested in. But for you, when it comes to finding out what your specialties are, how did you kind of decide or kind of come to that, or are you still deciding where you're going to go with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't yet decided, because I don't want to pigeonhole myself, and you really don't get a good idea of the flavors of medicine, I would say, until you're in your clinical years, and I haven't hit that milestone yet. So I don't want to pigeonhole myself and say what specialties that I definitively want to do, but I'm very much so interested in something surgical. And given my background in neuro-oncology, which is studying brain tumors. I'm really interested in neurosurgery. So as of right now, I'm preparing my CV basically as if I were to go into that residency training of neurosurgery. But I don't want to limit myself and just be unidirectional when it comes to figuring out what specialty I want to do. But there are a plethora of specialties you can choose from. I've known about a lot of them since high school just because I have a mentor who was an anesthesiologist, and I was in the OR and I got to see what some of the plastic surgeons do and other surgeons do, as well as anesthesiologists. So I've been familiar with all the specialties. Based on my research, I really like neurosurgery, but that can definitely change. But I would agree with you. I think until you're really in a program, as well as specifically in med school, I think it just takes time to better understand what each specialties entail and to identify with that. So I would agree in that sense.
Okay. And I'm wondering, like I was saying, because for me, when it comes to like, obviously I know you, so of course we've like had more in-depth discussions about like what you do, but I'm wondering, like, are there any like misconceptions you can feel like people that you may have encountered when it comes to like medical, like the medical industry or med students, or just people who generally are in that field?
Sure, yes. That's a really good question as well. I would say one misconception that I can think of that off the top of my head is I think a lot of family members who I've encountered being in med school will ask me questions about like, oh, I have this rash on my ankle. Can you diagnose me? Or do you know what this means? And do you know what this drug is? And just share things with me, expecting for me to know. As a med student, and really as a med student, you're the lowest person on the totem pole, and you're still learning the basics and the fundamentals of medicine. So for me, I think that's been a misconception, and that people believe that once you've gotten to med school and you've done at least 1 year, you can diagnose them and you know every drug there is in the medical field, and that's definitely not the case. So there have been times where I'm like, I'm only an MS blind, I don't know, or I'm in my PhD, I don't remember any of those things. But as well as in terms of some other misconceptions, I don't know if this is a misconception, but I think something that's very salient that I've noticed is that there's a stigma associated with physicians, and it may be just people in the healthcare industry in general. And I think there's a lot of mistrust, especially amongst minoritized individuals, like people of African descent. I think we tend to think that doctors don't have our best interest in mind and they only care about making a dollar. And also some of the tests and diagnostic tools that are used for patients, it's because of billing for healthcare insurance. And I think for me, I haven't gotten into that side yet. I think once I become a resident, I'll better understand the roles that healthcare insurance and billing like impact, you know, the diagnostic tools we perform, as well as like the imaging we do for our patients. So I think those kind of intricacies, I'm getting to know that I'm learning that there is this mistrust, and I'm curious to figure out and find out if the mistrust that I've noticed and observed between like Black communities and Latinx communities and the healthcare system, if it's to be true once I become a resident and I actually have patients. So I think those are the two things regarding mistrust as well as misconceptions that I've noticed thus far.
Okay. Yeah, because I don't know if you know Dr. Mike on YouTube. I think he's like a family doctor, but he does like all these like videos where he answers like comments, and he'll like, I don't know, like watch like different TV shows that are like medically related. And he's like talk because
Yeah.
he does talk about misconceptions sometimes. So I remember him saying like people think like, oh, doctors are rich, and he's like, actually no, we're not. And he like went into all these details as to why that's like.
Yeah.
So, and I had no idea that you have to pay for like malpractice insurance. I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's so real. It's so real because I think people definitely some people go into medicine thinking it's a get rich quick scheme, and that's not the case, especially for medical students. I'm MD PhD, so luckily I get a stipend, but I have friends who have finished their medical training and they may not come from like privileged families, and medical school tuition is obscene. The cost is very expensive. It's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars that you accumulate. And then immediately after, you have what's called residency training. And what they don't tell you is your first couple of, I think the first month or two of residency training, you don't get paid, which you're getting a salary as a resident. You're not as a medical student, but you don't get paid. So students have to take out even more loans on top of their medical school tuition to pay their first month's rent, as well as to be able to move to wherever they're going to begin their training. And it's just the amount of debt that you accumulate is, I think that I would definitely say that's something that students don't consider when they decide to become a doctor, and people who may glorify doctors don't think about. So I would definitely agree with you on that.
Okay. And so kind of like moving into more of like your broad experience, because I know you said that you went to Oxford. And so what was that like, especially because like the fact is, of course, you're there to learn, but then it's like not only that, but your environment is completely different than what, like you're used to in the US. Because I know in the US we have like culture in terms of different regions, but, being in that other country, what was that whole experience like?
Yes, being in the UK was an eye-opener, and I think I expected it to be, and it helped me to appreciate the States more, but it was also nice to get to know so many diverse perspectives beyond the US, and to meet people from all over the world. So when I went to Oxford, I did a research master's, and pretty much everybody in the department was most of the people were diverse. Most of the people, I would say, were from Europe or from the States, as well as a few people from Asia. So it was nice in that I got to meet people from all different walks of life, and people from the Middle East as well. I had a friend coming from, I don't know if it was Iran or where, but there were just so many diverse perspectives that I really appreciated that experience, getting to bond with people who I never would have in the States. I really was appreciative of that experience, and as well, I had a lot of personal growth that happened during that time I spent at Oxford, and that I became more independent because I had to fly there on my own, as well as navigate things on my own in the UK. So it made me more independent, and I'm very appreciative of that as well.
Okay. And then, because I was going to follow up, since you were talking about like, connections, I always ask about community, because I feel like sometimes being in another country and then also not having ways of making friends or just, building your own kind of camaraderie, because I feel like sometimes that can really affect your experience. So how did you mostly like find these friends, or how did you mainly, find a way to be social, at least build some kind of like social life outside of just going to school and then coming home?
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think community is one of the most important facets of a study abroad, or obtaining a degree that's abroad, that experience. I think having community is paramount. And I was able to acquire that through, we had colleges. And I think Oxford has a good they do a good job at trying to um, trying to build bonds and camaraderie among grad students. I think at least in the States, we kind of emphasize the importance of undergrads building community, and probably not to the same extent grad students. But at Oxford, both grad students and undergrads had great communities. When I was in Balliol College, there are a number of colleges in Oxford, at Oxford, and I was at Balliol, and it was a great college to be in. There would be social events where I got to meet other grad students, and that was a great opportunity, as well as they had a lot of Americans in that college, which was nice because I was able to bond with them over being far from home, as well as when I was in the lab. Anybody who's in the hard sciences and who works in a lab knows you get to know your lab mates very well, especially if you're in a lab that's warm and engaging and where there's camaraderie and teamwork that has to be done. So one of my closest friends, the closest friend I have from Oxford, she was a PhD student when I was a master's student. And so we got really close, as well as within, the way that labs are oriented in Oxford, it's such that all the grad students and master students are in one area. So I was able to meet a lot of other grad students in my department because we were all in the same area. So that's mainly how I met other people, was through lab as well as through my college. And it was a great experience. Now that I'm thinking about it and I recollect the opportunities that I had, I did have a great friendship network while I was there. And I think it was because of the way Oxford was structured, as well as just putting yourself out there and being open. It's something that's really important to making friends abroad.
Okay. And how long was the program that you were in?
Yeah, the program wasn't a structured program. So it could be a year to two. I told my PI, who is your group leader, the leader of my lab, before I started, that I was going to med school that July. When I started, I believe I started in August or so. So I think it was 10 months that I was there, but the program was like a year to 2 years. But because I had to go to med school, like we both knew that I could only be there for 10 months and finish the master's project.
Oh, okay. So, and then especially like when you're looking at your time there, do you like when you said that it kind of deepened your appreciation for the States? So do you feel like based on that experience, like just to formulate my question, like what kind of made you feel like it made you appreciate where you come from, and then also like just overall, like referring back to that statement?
Sure. I will say the main reason why I say it makes me appreciate the States is I think Europe in general, specifically the UK, the way in which they view race relations is a lot different from the States. And it's not to say it's a bad thing, but I think because I was a Black woman in Europe, specifically in the UK, and the UK isn't that diverse. And within the Black population, it's mainly immigrants. It's from Africa, like Nigeria or Ghana. I think my being a Black person my being an African American and not an African, I think it just kind of shifted my perspective of the country and the way I relate to the students. Like I made great friends there, but there isn't a great Black community in Europe, specifically in the UK, and that was something that was important to me. I think it was more so in the UK, a Black community, be it like Afro-European, African, Jamaicans, African Americans, there really wasn't that. And I think that's just what I miss, especially having gone to Spelman and been at Spelman, and then been in a situation which is the polar opposite, being in the UK, which is pretty homogenous in terms of race. So I think that was the main reason. The food as well. Like people, it's interesting because my lab for my PhD is very diverse. People from Europe, Spain, Argentina, India. Nobody likes American food. They hate it. But I missed it so much. The food in the UK was not the same. The chips and fish and chips, and that wasn't my cup of tea. I had Domino's almost every day in McDonald's when I wasn't eating salad because the food was just different. And I missed the food.
Okay,
the food was amazing.
Yeah, because I know like sometimes like especially when it comes to acculturation, that's like or the layman's term, which is culture shocks. I know like sometimes even like for me when I went to Germany, I was just one of the things I realized was, wow, people eat a lot of bread and there's like so much variety. And I have like anxiety when it comes to making choices. So I'm like, oh, there's like white bread, and then there's like Opa Wilhelm, and then there's like the dark bread, and then there's like the full corn, like the whole grain bread, and I'm like, and then it's like sausages. That's a whole variety of things. But yeah, I know like sometimes it can make you miss like certain things from home. But I also like when you're talking, especially like, you know, going further, like I feel like sometimes, especially when it comes to study abroad experiences, do you, from your own experience, do you feel like, you know, when it comes to like African Americans specifically, do you feel like we kind of are, like what demographic do you feel like we actually are able to study abroad? Because I sometimes feel like for me, when it comes to a lot of people within the Black community here, it's like when I talk about studying abroad, it's like, oh yeah, it would be nice to go you could go wherever. But a lot of times it's like, well, that's wishful thinking, or it's like there's I call it like almost like slavery mentality, because it's like, even though like we're not slaves anymore, but it feels like sometimes people feel like, I've been told like, oh, like, you know, kind of like, you know, in the sense of like, oh, you talk like a white person because I sound educated, you know, I don't know, I speak a certain way. And then you also have it to where it's like, oh, people like us don't do that. Do you kind of feel like that can sometimes be something that you've observed, or from your own perspective, or even like something you feel like we could probably do more of?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think sometimes we as a Black community can move. I think it is often perceived that we as Black people are a monolith, and we aren't multifarious and just multifaceted in terms of our thinking and our desires. So I do think that's a good point, in that, especially depending on where you're from and your family background, it may not be as people may not think that studying abroad is feasible or like financially responsible, which definitely depends on your school and how you're able to obtain the funding. I think that when it comes to Spelman and other historically Black colleges, because we're all Black, there were a lot of opportunities for us to study abroad. I don't know how it is at PWIs or predominantly white institutions, but I will say, in terms of for my experience alone, I always got positive reviews and feedback from my family, even those who are from like the deep south of Louisiana or come from the country. They were all just in awe of my going there. I didn't have anyone who had reservations about my going, but I have heard of people who were nervous about studying abroad because, you know, they're just used to being in the States, or they had only been in their hometown and they hadn't traveled, you know, outside of their hometown. So I think it definitely depends on the person and what they've been exposed to. But college, I think college and when you're young, it's the best time to study abroad, especially with college because you have scholarships that would allow you to study abroad in different programs. I know my sister studied abroad and she went with the program and didn't have to pay a dime. So college and in your 20s is the best time to study abroad and vacation. But I do agree that depending on where you're from, like if you're from the country or the deep south in the country or a small town, some parents and older people of older generations as they don't agree as much about going abroad, and they have like trepidation about it. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think because I sometimes feel like when we look, especially because I have family members, especially like some of my mom's side of the family, where they kind of like, I remember when I like was like, I'm going to move to Germany and be an au pair. They're like, why would you want to do that? Whereas like, my dad's side of the family, I remember a lot of them were just like, wow, that sounds like a good opportunity, see how it works out. And I think it's sometimes because you don't have those things modeled for you, it's kind of like, well, I don't know anybody who's done that. So therefore, why should I? That sounds dangerous. Because I remember even when I went to Mexico for the first time, because I was visiting a friend who actually was from there, and my mom freaked out. And I'm like, I'm going with someone I know, and he knows the area. So, but even like kind of moving in, I'm wondering, like, since you talked about like how that has impacted you in terms of like, personal development, I'm wondering, do you feel like those experiences have impacted your education and also like possible career aspirations?
In a sense, it has. I will say, as it relates to the research I did at Oxford, I still am doing cancer research, but it's a different type of cancer. I studied bladder cancer, which is very different from brain cancer, which is what I tend to study now. And in my PhD and what I think I'll end up studying. But there was a wealth of knowledge I learned on the education side in terms of being able to present a poster. I had done a bit of that at Spelman, but just learning more about presenting posters, creating presentations. I wrote a dissertation for my master's, and that was so helpful for my PhD. And I think the skills that I acquired, like writing skills and setting up experiments and learning about different techniques in the lab, I gained in my master's more than I did when I did research during college. And that was really helpful because the lab I was in for my PhD required that I be a bit more independent and creative and innovative in my thinking for the project. And I think I had acquired a good amount of skills during my master's program that helped me. So I did learn a lot education-wise as it pertains to conducting myself in a lab, writing for grants, dissertations, techniques for experiments, presenting, creating posters, as well as, like I said, personal and interpersonal. With labs, there are different personalities, and so I also learned how to be able to work with different interesting people.
Okay. And then, like, do you also even feel like, just from your perspective, even just as a student and based on like research and where you kind of are seeing the industry end up playing out, where do you feel like international education will become more relevant in your industry?
International education. I think when it comes to research and international relations, or just the ways in which we communicate research and interact with other countries as it relates to research, I think what we mainly see in the sciences are people coming here to the States. I think that's at large, that's what you see for postdoc positions. Because in the States, there's a postdoc shortage, and that's after your PhD. For those who don't have an MD and who want to be a professor and run a lab, you have to do what's called a postdoc after your doctoral degree, postdoc. And so I think as it relates to international international relationships for research, I think what you'll see a lot of is a lot of international students and research associates coming to the States to work in labs. That's especially in the north and in New York. Pretty much all labs are extremely diverse. People from Europe, India, Asia, just because there's a postdoc shortage, so, which requires us to get students and researchers from other countries. That's mainly why. And people want to get, and people at large see, at least on the biomedical side, they see United States labs as being first class, like world class, and we have so much funding here compared to Europe. So I think that's the trend we will see as it relates to research.
Yeah, because I always feel like from my end, as on the more linguistic side, I feel like sometimes, because international education is, I feel like it's a broad thing, because like sometimes it can be like foreign language, and of course that is always relevant, especially when you think about like we have like the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, things like that. We conquered a global pandemic that everybody had, was affected by, no matter where you're from. And so, and then there's also the fact that it's like, I think there's like also cultural education, just because again, because I feel like, as you just mentioned with international students, is you're working with people who are from different cultures. And so sometimes it's more of like learning how to understand how they, how they are, especially like, I mean, and then, trying to figure out how to collaborate when we all think and do things differently. So,
yeah, definitely. And then we're all socialized differently. A lot of the customs maybe in Europe are different, or other continents are different from North America.
Yeah, because I'm curious, like if you would ever, like I said, I know you, but like I'm just curious from your perspective. Do you think that in the future that you might potentially, like if you were offered an opportunity, would you actually be willing to do research abroad?
That's such a question. I would say we've had this conversation, I think a few months ago. I would say I'm erring on the side of no. I think it's not. I think in the healthcare field and in science, it's really hard to transition from being in the States to being in another country, especially as a physician. So I think realistically, I wouldn't, but if it were a perfect world where you can easily take your skills and they were transferable to another country, I don't know, I'm just so comfortable in the States, it's unfortunate to say in a sense, because I would like to have more of an open mind, but I was in the UK and overall, I had a great experience, but I don't think I would want to live abroad long term just because my family's in the States. But I definitely plan on traveling. I want to travel to other continents because I've been to Europe and I've been to Asia, but I want to travel to every continent.
Anyway, yeah, I mean, because I remember us having this conversation, because I remember I went to come, since I came to visit you a few months ago, but I remember like you made some really good points, and I was like, that would be on that, because I think like that's true, because I know like obviously like my perspective is different, but and of course, so I know that like and I feel like sometimes that can be complicated when you think about like for me, like I love traveling. I could live in Europe for the rest of my life if I wanted to. And then you mentioned that, family, because I also have to realize that that's a component, because the thing is that, especially being in my 20s and my parents had kids late. So it's like, like I need to spend more time with them because, they're getting older, but at the same time, it's like, I would still love to be there. And so that kind of makes a really good point,
Yeah, I mean, I think our 20s, it's the best time to live abroad Especially if that's something you're interested in doing. The 20s is the best time because our parents, they're getting older. My parents taught me when they were older as well. They're getting older, but there's still time. They're still not at the age. I think with your 20s, they're still not at the age where it's like, oh, I only have so much time left with them. So I think the 20s is a good time to live abroad for a bit. And you're young and you can explore your passions and what you really want to do before you get more responsibilities of like a partner maybe or a family if you ever just like for whoever's listening if that's something they wanted to do. I think the 20s is a great time to study abroad and to live abroad.
Yeah, because I especially love when you said earlier, in a perfect world, because like ideally, like that's the key thing, because life is never perfect. And like, because like for me, like I'm mainly like a single adult, so I have no responsibilities. I don't even have pets. Like I'm mainly focusing on work and then my business and my obviously this nonprofit. So I don't know. For me, I'm like, if I want to leave, like right now, I could, but like.
Yeah.
But like you were saying, in a perfect scenario, and not everyone has that same scenario.
That's so true. We all come from different backgrounds with different responsibilities. So it kind of makes it, and I think with those layers, it makes this opportunity and the option of going abroad makes it more individualized, and you have to weigh the pros and cons.
Yeah. Yeah. And so like kind of just to wrap up with my final question, I'm kind of curious as to, based on your own experiences, do you feel like international education as a whole, like in general, like with whether it be studying or working or living abroad is something that you would recommend? And I kind of would love to hear your honest perspective on that.
Yes, I definitely hands down would recommend having a study abroad experience, especially if you could be more independent and be integrated in a campus or maybe live with a host family, because it really allows you to immerse yourself in the study abroad experience and just living in a different country. I think it opens your eyes to different opportunities and just the world in general, because sometimes we think I think there are times where it seems as if we live in this bubble or a microcosm when in actuality there is life outside of the States and there's so many cultures to experience and enjoy. And studying abroad or living abroad is the best way to enjoy those things. And I think being able to be abroad, it does give you a sense of, in my opinion, independence, and you learn a lot. You have a lot of personal growth during that time because you have to become more independent, as well as just interact with different personalities in different cultures and the way that they do things and conduct themselves. But did you find going to Germany that you grew personally a lot and became more independent?
Yeah, I think so. Like mainly because first of all, I was afraid to leave the house sometimes. I was like when I first got there, I was like, because like, I think partly was like, because I know you were in like the UK where generally at least people speak English. But for me, it was just like, I learned this language and I'm scared to use it because I'm not used to like, it's like once you get off the plane, it's like automatically everything went from English to German. And eventually, and I'm like, I'm not used to this. Hold on. Like, I need like at least like a good week. And I was so like mentally exhausted because I was trying to use my German all the time. And I was working harder to understand a language that I'm not used to hearing on a daily basis. Eventually, I kind of got out more. And it was just like, I remember making a phone call to the Ausländerbehörde, the foreigners office, because I needed to make sure I got my resident permit. And I remember like so terrified. And eventually I made the phone call and I was like, I'm okay. I did this, and then especially like when I had to make arrangements to, when it comes to like play dates with the kids, because like their mom was gone for a few weeks. And so I'm like trying to arrange all these play dates. And I realized actually I could really be a mom. I was like, there, I mean,
Mhm.
we talked about this a lot, especially because I did, because, you know, I talked to you previously before about my experiences, but like, I love children, and I'm
Yeah.
like, it was a really big challenge dealing with children, and they don't speak your language. And then they're like, well, why don't you speak normal? And I'm like, I am speaking normal because I'm teaching you English.
Yeah, no, that's so true. The language piece I didn't interface with just because I went to an English speaking country, but that is also another thing that you could develop by going abroad, is sharpening your foreign language skills. So, which I think is great.
Yeah, I mean, and even learning how to use public transit, because in Lexington, which is where,
Mm,
you know, we're from, is that I'm not used to having a metro, like a subway, and having all these different ways of just getting around outside of just like a city bus. So that was a
yeah.
thing, like figuring out where I'm going. You know, like I remember, like, because my boyfriend at the time, he was German. He was from Bremen, which was like about an hour north, hour and a half north. And I remember sending him a picture of my metro ticket, and I was like, what does this mean? Like, what am I supposed to do with it?
Mhm.
So you also kind of, in a way, learn to ask for help, but you have to kind of use what you have. It's like, even though when I came in, I had an A2 level certificate of like my German skills. But the thing was, is that I'm
Mhm.
like, well, you know, I need something. So I need to use whatever language skills I have to, you know, get what I need. And it was the same thing when I was
Mhm.
when I was studying in France, because I mean, I had way more years. Like French is my second language, is the best language I speak. You know,
Mhm.
so with that, it's like, all right, well, I'm just going to, like I said, I'm comfortable. I can just go and do whatever I want. I have more freedom because I can kind of, I'm like, you know, of course I can survive in the States, but I'm like, wow, I can survive in this other country. Like, look at me.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's great. I think it's great, that through your experiences, you have been able to sharpen your French and your German. I think that's so important to, and I admire that you speak so many different languages. I used to take Spanish up until college, and my Spanish is horrible now, and I wish were better because I'm in East Harlem, and pretty much all of our patients speak Spanish. So I I second that studying abroad is great to learn a language, and I wish I I went to another European country where I could have learned the language. So.
Yeah. I mean, because now that you say that, like, so when you decided to go to Oxford, like, what was your process? I'm asking in a whole other question, but like, when you were looking at master's
Right.
programs and you decided on Oxford, I mean, what was your process of like selecting the school?
I because Oxford's known around the world as being a highly regarded institution. I think Oxford and Cambridge in the UK are some of the most popular unis that they have. So I was looking into both of those. And I wanted a program that didn't have classes because I just finished my degree at Spelman and I took a lot of classes, and I really just wanted a break in between um, my undergrad experience and my MD PhD. And Oxford had this master's in research, which allowed you to obtain a master's while just working in the lab and preparing a dissertation. And I felt like it would prepare me very well for my PhD. So those were the reasons why I selected Oxford. So I was interested in Oxford in general. And then they had a number of masters geared towards the biomedical sciences. And then I liked the one that I was in because I didn't have to take classes and I could really hone in on my research skills.
Okay. And then obviously, since with the foreign country component, like after getting accepted, like what was your visa like, yeah, I mean, I'm figuring out you probably had to have something to prove you could stay there, and then also like in the general sense of like funding, like what was that process more so for you?
Yeah, sure. So the funding I paid for myself. They do have some scholarships, but I think because I just come out of undergrad and I think I applied later on in the cycle, I didn't get any funding, so I paid for myself. But it, from what I remember, I applied to a couple of master's programs in the States at Northwestern and maybe either cyanide or something. And those were more expensive than the ones at Oxford. It was cheaper to obtain a degree there. And in terms of the visa process, I don't think I've told you. I don't really like telling anybody, but so I was in a rush to try and get to Oxford to start in the lab because I knew I had to finish early. So I hadn't completed, and I honestly didn't do my homework and research about the visa process. And my entering into the UK as a student for the year. And so I had an agreement with my lab that I was going to come at such and such a date, and I boarded the flight. And when I told them, I don't think I had finished my visa. I think I started it, but I hadn't finished my student visa. But when I got to, I don't, I don't know what it's called, but when they have to check your passport and do all of those things, and I told them I was a student, they would not let me enter the UK. My mom was with me, and she could stay because she was a visitor. But once I told them I was a student and I didn't have that visa finished, they detained me and they flew me back to the States. And I had to spend like a week and a half waiting for the visa to finish up to then go to Oxford and be admitted. Yeah. So that was okay. It was a bit tricky because I had no idea what I was getting myself into for the student visa, and it's not as if I was applying to Oxford through like the NIH or a U.S. Funding body or a U.S. institution. So I didn't have any help in that regard. So it was a bit tough and tricky, especially because I had to be detained, which was interesting. But yeah, but I finally made it to Oxford a week and a half later after being
Okay.
shipped back.
Yeah, I don't know. Because I feel like sometimes like it also can depend because I know in the EU, you like I think especially like around the time of like, before Brexit happened, but it was mainly like the EU specifically. It's like as long as you came from like I think like the US was one of them, like Japan, I think like Canada and like three other countries, it's like you can come in and you don't have to have a visa prior to entry, but it's like if you're staying past 90 days, then you just go to
Yeah.
you just get a resident permit. But I think like with the UK, now that you're explaining to me, it's a little bit different. So like that's kind of good to know. So it's more of like, so for our listeners, like make sure you research what your visas are, what your visa process is. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, definitely do that because you will waste your money. If you don't, make sure you do all your homework and your research. Definitely echo that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you got to be on the podcast and share your experiences and your knowledge, and kind of like going back into like retrospect. Because I really hope that what you're telling us actually is going to help somebody who's listening, especially if they are in the medical industry or at all just interested in going that route with international education. So, I appreciate your time.
Yes, no, Jazz, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be on the podcast. And I'm so proud of you for launching this podcast. I think this would be such a great tool for students and just people in general who have a desire to study abroad and live abroad and learn foreign languages. So I'm excited for this podcast.
Oh yeah, so I am too. So again, I'm glad you're a part of it. So as you guys know, like Gabby's my best friend. So I feel like for the most part we're always supporting one another. So, but
yeah, I know for sure. Jazz, I love you and I value our friendship so much. And I know this is not like part of the podcast topic, but I love that we're able to bounce ideas off of each other, and because we come from so different worlds that are so different. You on the linguistic side and me on the healthcare side. I learned so much when we're together or even when we're talking, honestly.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny because I remember when I first met you, I was like, okay, wow, she's smarter than me. Okay.
No, you know so many languages. For you to be multilingual, I don't know if that's what it's called, but
Yeah.
your brain has to be wired completely different. I have so much respect. Like I could never learn. I can't even learn Spanish that well. So I am in awe of how many languages you know. Like my family's so impressed. My mom's like, oh my gosh, I wonder if Dad could teach me Spanish. So impressed.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening, and we'll talk to you in the next episode. All right. Bye.
Sounds good. Bye.